She practiced crying for her husband's funeral, but at his grave not one tear came. Elena Cross wasn't grieving Carlo Graves. She was realizing she had already mourned the woman he destroyed. But when Mafia boss Dante Rowe saw the truth behind her silence, everything Carlo buried began to rise. This story reminds us that freedom can begin with one small rebellion. Like, comment, share, and subscribe if you believe Elena deserves a new life.
I practiced crying for my husband's funeral, 20 minutes in front of the bathroom mirror that morning, pressing my fingers just below my eyes until something came, checking whether it looked real enough, whether it looked like a wife who'd lost something. It didn't, really, but I got good enough. Now I'm standing at the graveside, and the tears won't come at all. Not because I'm numb, not because I'm in shock. I know exactly where I am, and exactly what day it is, and exactly what I'm supposed to feel. I just don't feel it. And somewhere underneath the black Valentino dress, and the borrowed composure, a very tired part of me thinks, well, that tells you something, doesn't it? Carlo wanted red roses. He always wanted red. Red for power, red for drama, red for the version of himself he performed for every room he walked into. I ordered white. It was the smallest possible rebellion, barely even counts. But I stood in that flower shop 2 days ago, and I pointed at the white roses, and I said those ones, and the woman behind the counter said beautiful choice. And I thought, yes, finally, mine. That's what grief looks like when it isn't grief. It looks like choosing the flowers yourself, for once. Around me, the Graves family assembles in full black. His brothers, Nico and Stefan, standing like they're already dividing territory in their heads. His cousins. His mother, Donna Rose, directly behind my left shoulder. Close enough that I can feel her presence like a second shadow. She's crying. Her grief is enormous and genuine and completely suffocating. I accept a hand on my arm, nod at the right moments, keep my face arranged into something soft and distant, the expression of a woman too deep in sorrow to be fully present. I've been practicing that expression for 5 years. That's the thing they don't tell you about a certain kind of marriage. You don't just survive it, you perform it, every day. You learn which version of yourself keeps the temperature in the room low. You learn which words land wrong and which silences are safe. You become so good at performing calm, performing gratitude, performing fine that you start to lose track of where the performance ends. I found out where it ended 3 weeks ago, when they brought Carlo home. I sat at the kitchen table. I read the papers the family attorney put in front of me, and I waited for the grief to arrive. The real kind. The heavy kind that was supposed to mean something. It didn't come. I looked down at my hands instead. No bruises. The last ones had faded 10 days before he died. I remember thinking that clearly. The bruises are gone. Not my husband is dead. The bruises are gone. That's when I understood something I'd been circling for years without ever landing on it. I wasn't grieving because some part of me had been quietly grieving for a long time already. Not him. The life I thought I was going to have. The woman I was before I became Carlo Graves's wife. You can mourn something while it's still technically alive. I've been doing it for years. I feel him before I see him. It's not instinct exactly. It's more like a shift in the atmosphere. A change in the way people are standing, the way their attention redistributes without them meaning for it to. I turn my head slightly. He's standing at the far edge of the cemetery, not among the mourners, not in the rows of black suits pressing forward toward the grave, just at the perimeter, hands in his coat pockets, completely still, in the way that only very dangerous men manage to be still. Dante Rowe. I know who he is. Of course I do. You spend 5 years in this world, and you learn the names that matter. Dante Rowe is the kind of name that ends conversations when it enters them. Carlo hated him the way men hate people they secretly respect. He's watching the service. And then he isn't watching the service. He's watching me. I turn back to the grave. My hands stay folded in front of me. The priest keeps speaking. I keep breathing. But I felt it. The weight of being actually seen, not performed at. It landed differently than I expected. I don't know yet what to do with that. He finds me 20 minutes later, near the garden at the edge of the grounds. I'd slipped away from Donna Rose and the brothers and the endless line of hands to shake. I needed 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes of no one looking at me. He walks up without announcing himself. Most men that size make noise. He doesn't. Mrs. Graves. I turn around slowly. He's closer than I expected. Dark coat, dark eyes. The kind of face that's been made by experience rather than age. Mr. Rowe, I say, you shouldn't be here. That's the fourth time someone's told me that today. The first three were right. So am I. Something shifts in his expression, not offense, something more like recalibration. Like he'd prepared for a different kind of conversation and is quietly adjusting. He says, I wanted to offer my condolences. I look at him straight. Don't. He stops. Don't say things we both know aren't true, I tell him. You're not sorry he's gone. And I haven't lost something, the way you're implying. We can save each other the time. The silence between us is long. He doesn't fill it with a defense, doesn't get cold. He just looks at me the way people rarely look at me. Like I said something worth actually considering. All right, he says finally. That's it, just all right. I nod once and walk away. I don't look back. But I feel his gaze the entire length of the path, all the way to the waiting cars, all the way until the door closes behind me. And the strange thing, the thing I won't admit to anyone, not even Gia, is that it didn't feel like being watched. It felt like being found. I don't know what to do with that either. So I do what I've always done. I fold it up. I put it somewhere quiet. I make my face soft and distant, and I get in the car. 3 days after the funeral, I started going through Carlo's things, not because I was ready, because I needed to do something with my hands, and lying in bed staring at the ceiling wasn't working anymore. The villa felt like a held breath. His mother moved through the hallways, like a ghost who hadn't figured out yet that it was her job to haunt the place. His brothers kept stopping by, with food no one ate, and conversations that were really just surveillance wrapped in pasta. I needed to move. I started in the bedroom, his side of the closet first. Suits, mostly, dark ones. The kind that cost more than most people's rent. I folded them into boxes without thinking too hard about it, just folding, just moving. The physical act of it was almost a relief. Here is a thing I can do. Here is a problem with a solution. Here is a box that starts empty and ends full. Then I got to the bathroom. There's a mirror in there. Tall one, framed in dark wood, set at an angle near the window. The corner of it is cracked. Has been for 2 years. The repairman came twice. Both times Carlo canceled the appointment without telling me. I used to stand at the wrong angle in that mirror. That's how the crack happened, not the way you're thinking. Carlo didn't throw anything. He never threw anything. That wasn't how he operated. What happened was this. I was getting ready for dinner one night. His family was coming over. I was standing in front of that mirror doing my hair, and he came in and stood in the doorway and watched me for a moment and then said, very calmly, you've been looking at yourself a lot lately. I said I was just doing my hair. He said, women who spend a lot of time looking in mirrors are usually thinking about someone else. I turned around to look at him, and when I turned back, I was standing at the wrong angle. The angle where the light hits the crack wrong and makes it worse. I didn't use that mirror much after that. I'm looking at it now. No, the clinical name for what Carlo did. I studied psychology for 3 years before I dropped out of my graduate program. I read textbooks full of terms like coercive control and gaslighting and systematic isolation. I wrote papers about it, got good grades on those papers, and I still didn't recognize it when it was happening to me. That's the part that's hardest to explain to people. They assume you'd know. They assume that education is the same as protection, that if you've read the chapter, you can spot the chapter playing out in your real life. You can't. Not always. Not when it comes at you slowly, one small thing at a time, each piece just small enough to explain away. Each incident just reasonable enough that you can convince yourself you're overreacting. That's not stupidity. That's how it works. It doesn't arrive as a monster. It arrives as a man who loves you very much and just gets a little quiet when you spend too long on the phone with your friends. Then the friends start to feel complicated. Then the phone stays in your purse more often. Then one day, you're canceling plans because it's easier, and you're not even sure when that became the default. But by the time you realize what's happened, you're already inside it. I close the bathroom door and keep packing. Gia shows up around noon. No call first. She has a key I hid in the potted fern by the elevator 18 months ago. Carlo didn't know about it. That was the point. She walks in, looks at me standing in the middle of the bedroom, surrounded by boxes, and doesn't say anything for a long moment. She just takes off her coat, drapes it over a chair, and kneels down beside the nearest box and starts folding. That's Gia. She doesn't ask if you need help. She just helps. We work in silence for a while. There's something almost peaceful about it. Two people in a room, just doing a task. No performance required. Then she says quietly, you don't have to be okay right now. I know. You've been holding your shoulders up around your ears since the funeral. I hadn't noticed. I let them drop. The tension that releases is immediate and embarrassing, like I'd been bracing for something without knowing it. I'm not sad, I tell her. That's the weird part. It's not grief. I don't know what it is. I do, she says. She doesn't look up from the folding. It's what happens when your nervous system has been running on high alert for so long that when the threat is gone, it doesn't know how to stop. You're not broken. You're just still running. I look at her. When did you get a therapy degree? I've been doing research, she says simply, for the last 2 years, quietly, because I didn't know how to bring it up. The room goes quiet again, the soft kind. I knew something was wrong, she says. I want you to know that. I saw it happening. I just didn't. I was scared if I pushed you to talk about it, you'd pull away. And losing you entirely felt worse than waiting. You did the right thing. Did I? Yes. I fold a shirt I don't remember buying. You stayed close. That was the right thing. That was everything. She looks up at me, finally. Her eyes are wet. When you're ready to talk about it, she says, all of it, I'm here. I know. She nods once, goes back to folding. I think about how rare that is, a person who shows up without a script, who doesn't need you to perform grief on a schedule, who doesn't ask you to be stronger than you are or further along than you are, who just sits on the floor with you and folds shirts. Most people don't know how to do that. Most people need you to be okay so they can be okay. Gia just needs you to be honest. Even when honest is sitting on a floor, not crying at a dead husband, while your hands shake slightly and you don't know what day it is. I find the safe at 4 in the afternoon. I'd moved into Carlo's office, because that's where the important papers were supposed to be. His attorney had given me a list: insurance documents, deeds, investment accounts, things I'd need to deal with. I found most of them in the filing cabinet by the desk. The painting on the east wall, I'd always assumed it was just decoration. Carlo had a lot of art he bought because it looked expensive, not because he liked it. But when I went to move it to check the wall behind it, it swung outward on a hinge. The safe behind it was small, black, steel. I stood there for a moment. Then I tried the combination I'd memorized 18 months ago. Watched from the doorway one night when Carlo thought I was asleep. It opened. 3 notebooks, hardbound, black covers, pages dense with his handwriting. I picked up the first one. It was dated from 3 years into our marriage. At the top of the first page, in Carlo's precise, controlled script, Thursday. Then a list. Who I'd called that day. How long each call lasted. What he'd overheard. One entry read, spent 40 minutes on the phone with G. Evasive when asked about the topic. Monitor. I put it down. Picked up the second one. Same format. 2 years of daily entries. Not every day, some weeks had gaps, but enough, more than enough. My hands had gone very still. I set both notebooks aside and looked at what else was in the safe. An envelope, sealed. The name on the front, written in the same careful handwriting. Dante Rowe. I didn't open it, I just held it. Then, at the very bottom of the safe, a single sheet of paper. No date. If I'm gone before this gets where it needs to go, it'll find its way. It always does. I read that line 3 times. Then I sat down on the floor of my dead husband's office, with his surveillance notebooks beside me, and an envelope addressed to his enemy in my hand, and I thought, I don't know who this man was. Not really. I thought I knew. I spent 5 years building a complete picture of him, cataloging every mood and trigger and preference, learning his patterns the way you learn the layout of a room in the dark, by memory. By feel, by the bruises you collect until you stop running into the furniture. But this, I didn't know about this. I called Gia from the floor. She answered on the second ring. Gia. My voice came out steadier than I expected. I think Carlo was doing something bigger than anything I knew about. And I think it involves Dante Rowe. A pause. Are you safe right now? Yes. Don't move anything else tonight. Are you at the villa? His office. I'm coming back. Don't touch anything else. She hung up. I sat there in the quiet office, holding an envelope with another man's name on it, and I thought about all the things I thought I knew. About the years I spent surviving a man I didn't actually understand. About how you can be inside something completely and still only see part of it. About how much I still didn't know. And underneath all of that, quieter than everything else, one strange small thought. He sent it to Roe, of all the people, of all the names in his world. Why him? Across town, Dante Rowe was asking his own questions. He'd been at it since midnight. Marcus sat across from him at the long table in the back office, coffee going cold between them, a stack of financial documents spread across the surface. The withdrawal started in March, Marcus said. He pointed to a line on the page, 3 separate accounts. Total amount moved significant, but not traceable through the usual channels. Dante didn't respond. He was reading. Marcus watched him. Dante had a particular quality when he was working through a problem, a stillness that wasn't passive, more like a compression, everything focused inward. You could see him turning it. It's not operational, Dante said finally. The amounts are wrong, too irregular for payments, too consistent for personal expenses. Which leaves what? Insurance, Dante said. Or leverage. He was building something. Marcus leaned back. He had something else on his mind. Dante could always tell Marcus got a certain quality of quiet that wasn't the same as his thinking quiet. It was the quiet of a man choosing his words. Say it, Dante said. The widow. Dante looked up. I talked to someone, Marcus said carefully. Someone who used to work in the house. She left 8 months ago, she said. He paused. Carlo wasn't a kind man at home, Dante. The room went very quiet. Dante set the papers down. How long have you known this? I heard something a while back. Rumors. I didn't have anything solid. And at the time, Marcus stopped. At the time, it wasn't our problem, Dante said. He didn't say it like an accusation. He said it like a fact he was examining from all sides, turning it over, looking at what it actually was. Marcus said nothing. Dante stood up, walked to the window. The city below was its usual nighttime version of itself, still moving, still lit, indifferent to the conversations happening above it. He thought about her at the funeral. The way she stood, the way she didn't cry, the way she looked at him not with fear, not with the performance of grief, but with something direct and tired, and completely clear-eyed. Don't say things we both know aren't true. He thought about what that kind of clarity costs a person. How long you have to carry something before you get that calm about it. Find out everything, he said. About the withdrawals, about the accounts, and about her. He turned back toward the table. Who she was before. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Before she was a Graves. Her name is Elena Cross, Dante said. Find out who that person was. Donna Rose came over the morning, after the funeral flowers were taken away. She sat on the white sofa in the villa's front room and accepted the coffee I brought her, and held the cup in both hands. The way older women do like warmth is something to be held on to, not just consumed. She was 63 years old, and she'd buried a husband and a son, and she wore that grief the way some people wear their posture, upright, organized, almost architectural. I sat across from her and waited. We need to discuss your future, she said. Do we? You're young. She paused, looked at me carefully. You're a beautiful woman without family support in this city. That creates complications. For whom? She set her cup down. For everyone, Elena. The family is in a transition. There are men in Carlo's world who will see his widow as an opportunity. For alliance, for leverage. I'm not available for either of those things. You're a widow. By definition. By definition, I said. I'm a woman whose husband died. That's the only definition I need. She was quiet for a moment. Donna Rose had a way of gathering herself when she was recalibrating. You could see it happen, something behind her eyes rearranging. Carlo would have wanted the family to look after you. I kept my voice even. Carlo's preferences aren't really applicable anymore. Elena, her voice had an edge now, soft, but an edge. There are people in this family who believe a formal arrangement should be made to protect the assets Carlo left in your name. To ensure I don't do anything inconvenient with them. She didn't deny it. I stood up. Donna rose. I love you. I genuinely do. But I'll be out of the villa by the end of the week. I have my own place. I have my own work. I have my own money that has nothing to do with Carlo or this family. I picked up her coffee cup, a small act of courtesy that I meant. I will behave with complete dignity. I will not embarrass anyone. And I will make my own decisions. She looked at me for a long moment. There was something complicated in her face. Not quite anger, not quite respect. Something in between that she didn't have a category for. You're not what most people think you are, she said finally. I know, I said. Carlo counted on that. I showed her out. Then I stood in the empty front room and breathed for a full minute. That was the thing nobody tells you about reclaiming small pieces of yourself. It's terrifying every single time. You'd think it would get easier. It doesn't. Not at first. Your body has spent years learning that saying no to certain things has a cost. The fear is still there, even when the thing you feared is gone. You have to make the choice anyway. You have to do it scared. Dante Rose showed up at my new apartment on a Tuesday. No call, no warning. Just a knock on the door at 11 in the morning. And when I checked the peephole, there he was, dark coat, hands in his pockets, looking at the door with the particular patience of someone who isn't used to waiting but is willing to, just this once. I opened the door. You know where I live, I said. I do. That's not a compliment. It wasn't meant as one. He met my eyes. It was meant to be honest. I know things. That's what I do. You should factor that in. I looked at him for a moment. I appreciated that. Actually, the directness of it. No pretense that the information was innocent. No, I just happened to be in the neighborhood. He knew where I lived because he'd found out where I lived, and he was telling me that plainly. 10 minutes, I said. And you stand where I can see you. He stepped inside. He stood in the center of the living room and looked around the way certain people look at spaces, not decorating it with his eyes, just taking stock, noting the exits probably, noting the layout. Men like him always take stock. You found the safe, he said. I didn't answer right away. Just watched him. What makes you say that? Because you opened the door. He turned to face me. If you hadn't found anything, you wouldn't have let me in. He wasn't wrong. There was an envelope, I said. Your name on it. Something moved in his face. I watched it happen, a very brief, very controlled reaction that he almost managed to suppress entirely. Almost. I didn't know about an envelope, he said. I know. I crossed my arms. Your face just told me that. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what did you study? Psychology. Why? Because you read people like you've been trained to. I was trained to, I said. I don't practice anymore. Why not? The question landed simply. No agenda behind it that I could detect. He just asked it the way someone asks something they actually want to know. I said. Carlo thought women who did that kind of work had a hard time being loyal to their husbands. Too much analyzing. Dante didn't respond immediately. He looked at me for a long moment in a way that wasn't uncomfortable, it was just thorough. The way you look at something you're trying to understand, correct? He was afraid you'd see through him, he said. I stared at him. It was such a simple sentence, and it was exactly right. And in 5 years, in all the conversations I'd had about my marriage, all the circles I'd talked myself in, no one had ever said it that directly. Not even Gia. I'd never said it to myself. What's in the envelope? He asked. I don't know. I didn't open it. I went to the kitchen counter where I'd placed it that morning and brought it back, set it on the coffee table between us. I figured you had a right to see it before I did. He picked it up, opened it carefully. I watched him read. His face did nothing, no reaction. Nothing visible, but his stillness changed. The compression thing Marcus probably knew well. Everything going inward. It's fabricated, he said. What is it? Documents. Made to look like I ordered a hit on a joint business partner. Took his share of the proceeds. He kept reading. Carlo built this from real transactions and put my name on the decisions he made. He looked up. He was building a case against me, one I couldn't defend against easily. Why not just use it? Why keep it in a safe? Because he was saving it. Dante set the papers down. For the right moment. Or, he stopped. I looked at the papers again. At the bottom of the stack, a page I hadn't seen when I'd glanced through it the first time. I picked it up, read it. Stomach went cold. He was going to put me in it, I said. Dante was quiet. This transaction here. I pointed to a line on the page. He listed me as a party to it. As someone who knew, I set it down. My hands were very steady, which surprised me. I didn't know. I didn't know anything about any of this. I know that, Dante said. You don't actually know that. No, he said, but I believe it. He looked at me directly. There's a difference between not having proof and not believing someone. I don't need the first to have the second. Something shifted in the room. Not romantically, nothing like that. More like two people suddenly occupying the same side of something when they'd expected to be on opposite sides. Why would you believe me? I asked. Because I watched you at the funeral, he said simply. And you are not a woman who knew about this and stood there like that. I didn't have an answer for that. He picked up the papers and straightened them. I can find out where the money actually went. The real transactions, the ones Carlo used to build this. I have people who can trace it back to its source. It'll take time. And what do you want in return? He looked at me. Nothing right now. Men like you don't do things for nothing. No, he agreed. But sometimes the accounting is slower than people expect. He stood. I'll be in touch. He left. I stood in my living room for a long time after that, looking at the closed door. Then I looked down at the envelope on the coffee table, at the name written on the front in Carlo's handwriting. My husband had tried to use me as a weapon against this man, had positioned me in documents without my knowledge, without my consent, like a chess piece he'd placed on the board, while I was busy trying to survive daily life in his house. That was the thing about coercive control, it never really had one face. It didn't just look like a mirror you stopped using, or friends you slowly stopped calling. Sometimes it looked like a sealed envelope in a safe. Sometimes it looked like paperwork. Sometimes you didn't find out what you'd been used for until after the person doing it was already gone. Nico and Stefan showed up at 6. I heard them talking in the hallway before they knocked. Their voices have a particular overlap. They finish each other's sentences in a way that's almost comfortable until you realize none of those sentences are really asking you anything. I opened the door before they knocked. Nico was in front. He was 41, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of easy authority that came from spending his whole life being large in rooms where that counted. We saw Rose's car, he said. He had questions about Carlo's estate. What kind of questions? The legal kind, I said. The kind attorneys authorize. Stefan, behind him, you shouldn't be talking to him, Elena. About anything, Nico added. I looked at them both. They weren't threatening, not overtly. They were doing the thing that's harder to name than threats. The thing that looks like concern, but functions like instruction. The thing I'd spent 5 years learning to navigate. Is that a request, I said, or a suggestion? We're trying to protect you. I know, I kept my voice entirely level, and I appreciate that you see it that way. But I'll decide who I with and about what. Nico's expression shifted. He wasn't used to this version of me. For 5 years I'd been Carlo's wife, which meant, in their world, I'd been contained, managed, present at dinners, absent from decisions. The family he started. I'm not family, I said. I was married to your brother. He's gone. I carry my own name now. I held the door. Good night, I said. There was a beat, just one, where Nico decided whether to push it. I watched him make the decision. Watched something in his face fold back into itself. They left. I closed the door. Stood with my back against it. My hands were shaking. That was okay. That was allowed. The shaking didn't mean I was wrong. It didn't mean I should have stayed quiet. It just meant my body was still learning the difference between danger and the feeling of danger, still learning that standing your ground and holding a door open is not the same thing as being in a room where something bad is about to happen. You can be scared and still be right. You can shake and still not open the door back up. I breathed through it, in and out. The shaking slowed. Then I went to the kitchen, made tea I didn't particularly want, and sat at the table in my own apartment in my own chair, and let myself feel the strange, uncomfortable, necessary feeling of a decision that was entirely mine. It didn't feel like freedom yet, not quite, but it felt like the direction of it, the first steps of something that pointed that way. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup. That, I thought, is enough for today. 2 weeks after the funeral, Gia came back with wine and no agenda. That was her way of saying she had an agenda, but wanted it to feel like a choice. She knew me well enough to know I wouldn't open a door marked serious conversation. But I'd open one marked Tuesday night, nothing going on, brought the good stuff. She set the bottle at the kitchen counter and found 2 glasses without being shown where they were. She'd always been good at making herself at home in other people's spaces, not in the intrusive way. In the way that says, I'm not a guest here. You don't have to perform for me. We sat on the living room floor. Her choice. I didn't question it. Sometimes, a floor is just the right height for certain conversations. We talked about nothing for a while. Her job. A case that was driving her toward early retirement or a felony, she couldn't decide which. A movie she'd seen twice because she'd fallen asleep the first time and had principles about finishing what she started. I laughed. It sounded strange coming out of me, like a sound from another time. Then the room got quieter. Gia refilled my glass and set the bottle between us and looked at me in that direct, unhurried way she had. Not pressing, just present. The way you look at someone when you're letting them know the door is open. Tell me, she said. Just that. Tell me. I looked down at my glass. I don't know where to start. Doesn't matter. Start anywhere. So I did. I didn't tell it in order. I told it the way it actually lives in fragments, in images, in the specific things you remember, because they lodged themselves somewhere under your skin and never fully came out. I told her about the mirror, the crack in the corner, the angle I stopped standing at. I told her about the phone, how there were numbers I stopped calling because the questions afterward weren't worth it, how it happened gradually, one comment, then another, then the comments stopped, because I'd already internalized them. The phone sat in my purse. The friends got quieter. I told myself I was just busy. I told her about the textbook, my copy of a clinical psychology reference guide, 3rd edition that I'd kept from graduate school. How one night Carlo had picked it up off the bookshelf and flipped through it and set it back down and said, very reasonably, I just wonder if it's good for you to keep dwelling in all this. How it had disappeared from the shelf 3 days later. How I'd never asked about it. How asking would have cost more than the book. I told her about the morning I woke up and couldn't remember the last time I'd made a decision, a real one, not a managed one, not one I'd pre-cleared in my head for how it would land, just a decision that was only mine. That's year 3. Gia's listened to all of it. She didn't interrupt. She didn't make the face people sometimes make, the one that means I don't know what to do with this, so I'm going to look very concerned, and then change the subject. She just listened, kept her eyes on me, occasionally nodded, let the silences be silences instead of rushing to fill them. When I stopped talking, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you know this wasn't your fault. I looked at my wine. Not because you weren't smart enough to see it. Not because you were weak. She leaned forward slightly. The people who do this, they're skilled at it, Elena. They specifically look for people who are capable and self-aware, because those people are more likely to turn it inward, more likely to analyze themselves instead of questioning the person hurting them. That's not a bug. That's the design. You were targeted because you were strong. That's the thing. The room was very quiet. I'd read that, technically. I'd read exactly that in textbooks, written by researchers who studied this for decades. I'd underlined versions of that sentence with a yellow highlighter, and written C also, chapter 7 in the margins. Knowing something and believing it are completely different things. This is the first time I believe it, I said. Gia exhaled. Okay, she said softly. That's the place we start from. We sat there for a long time after that. The wine got warm. Neither of us moved to fix it. Sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is stay in the room with them while they hold something heavy, not taking it from them, not telling them it isn't heavy, just being there so they aren't holding it alone. Gia was good at that, better than anyone I'd ever known. I thought about all the years I'd managed without her close. All the years I'd kept her at a careful distance because closeness had costs. And I thought about how much of my life I'd spent protecting other people from the truth, in order to protect myself from having to say it. The truth is exhausting to carry alone. I didn't know that until I put some of it down. That same night, across the city, Dante read every page. Marcus had spent 4 days tracking down the people who'd worked inside the Graves household. Not pressuring them, just making it known, through the right channels, that he was listening if anyone wanted to talk. That sometimes people needed to talk. 3 came forward. The housekeeper who'd left 8 months ago. The driver who'd been with Carlo for 6 years before quietly requesting a transfer. a woman who'd managed the household accounts and had kept her own records, privately, for reasons she'd never fully explained to herself until someone asked. Their accounts didn't always match in details. Memory doesn't work that way. But the shape of what they described was consistent. The texture of it, the particular atmosphere of a house where everything looked fine and nothing felt right. Dante read the driver's account first, then the housekeeper's, then the accountant's, which was the most careful and the most specific and the hardest to read. He didn't stop. He didn't skip anything. He sat at his desk with the door closed, and he read every word. And the city moved outside his window, indifferent, and he let himself take in exactly what was on those pages. When he finished, he stood up, walked to the window, stood there for a long time. Marcus came in without knocking. He was one of two people in Dante's life who had that right and stood beside him without asking anything. Dante said 12 years. Marcus said nothing. We worked with him for 12 years. We sat at his table. We dealt with him directly, hand to hand. Dante didn't look away from the window. We knew what Carlo Graves was in a room. We knew how he operated, and not once he stopped. We didn't know, we didn't ask. Dante's voice was quiet, not angry. Something past anger. Something that had already moved through anger and come out the other side. There's a difference. We didn't ask because it wasn't our business, because it was easier not to know, because knowing would have meant dealing with it. He finally turned. We made that choice. Not knowing wasn't something that happened to us. We arranged it. Marcus looked at him steadily. You're not responsible for what Carlo did. No. But I'm responsible for the conditions I was willing to operate in. He moved back to the desk, sat down. We don't have to be the ones pulling the trigger to be part of the structure that makes things possible. The room was quiet. Marcus thought about that. He had the honesty to admit, privately, that it landed correctly. What do you want to do? He asked. Dante looked at the files on his desk. I want to find out what he was building with that money. And I want to know who Elena Cross is. The real version. He paused. Not the Graves widow. Her. Marcus picked up his coat from the chair. I'll have something for you by Thursday. And, Marcus. Dante looked up. What you said earlier about the rumors you heard. About knowing something was wrong and not acting on it. Marcus waited. I'm not criticizing you, Dante said. I'm telling you I understand it. Because I would have done the same thing. And I think that's worth sitting with. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. It is. He left. Dante sat alone at his desk for a long time. Not working, just sitting with it. The particular weight of recognizing something true about yourself that you'd have preferred to keep comfortable and vague. That was the harder discipline, not action reflection. Looking directly at the thing you'd rather look away from. He was still learning how. The coffee shop was Elena's choice. Not his office, not her apartment. Neutral ground. A place with other people in it. Ambient noise. No symbolism attached. She'd named it in a text the previous morning, short and direct. If you want to go through the envelope together, I'm available Thursday at 10. There's a place on West 22nd I like, not negotiable on the location. He'd replied, Thursday at 10. He arrived first, took a table in the back corner, old habit facing the door, ordered coffee, waited. She came in at exactly 10. Dark coat, hair down, moving through the coffee shop with the particular economy of someone who knows where they're going and doesn't need to announce it. She spotted him immediately, came over, sat down across from him, and put the envelope on the table between them before she even took her coat off. Good morning, she said. Good morning. She ordered coffee from the passing server without looking at the menu. Another person who knew what she wanted. He noticed that. I want to watch you read it, she said, in real time, so I can see your reactions. That's thorough. I studied interrogation techniques my junior year, not to interrogate people, just because I was curious about how deception works. She looked at him. You have good control. But nobody's perfect. Nobody, he agreed. He opened the envelope. He read carefully. Elena watched him the way she'd said she would, not intrusively, not theatrically, just steadily, noting things. He got to the middle section and felt his jaw tighten, forced it to relax. Carlo had built this from real transactions, pieces Dante recognized, and had rearranged them carefully, surgically, into a narrative that pointed every decision back to him. It was well done. If he hadn't lived the actual sequence of events, He might have believed it himself. He got to the bottom of the stack and stopped. Read the final page twice. He put you in it, he said. Yes. This transaction. He listed you as a knowing party. Yes. Her voice was even. I wasn't. I didn't know any of this existed. He looked at her. I know. You keep saying that, because I keep meaning it. She looked at him for a moment. Most people in your position would assume I was involved. It's the simpler explanation. Simpler isn't always right. He set the papers down. And I watched you at the funeral, Elena. You're not a woman who knew about this, and then stood at that grave like that. Something shifted in her expression. Brief and controlled, but there. What does that mean? She asked. It means that what I saw at the grave wasn't a performance. It was someone who'd been surviving something, and had run out of the energy to pretend otherwise. He picked up his coffee. You can't fake that. I've been watching people fake things my entire life. You weren't. She was quiet. The coffee shop moved around them. Someone, 2 tables over, was having a work call, speaking in the low, urgent voice of a person who was already late for something. The espresso machine behind the counter built and released its pressure. Outside the window, November continued its gray argument with the city. I can trace the actual transactions, Dante said. The real ones, the ones Carlo built this from. I have people who can reconstruct the original sequence ends and document where the decisions actually came from. He paused. It'll take time. 2, 3 weeks. But it can be done. And what does that do for me? It means if anyone ever picks this up, if this envelope reaches anyone with the authority to act on it, there's a counter-record. Something that makes the fabrication visible. Elena looked at the papers on the table. He was going to use me to get to you. He put my name on something I had no knowledge of so that destroying you would destroy me at the same time. Yes, he did that, she said quietly, while I was in the same house, while I was managing his calendar and attending his dinners, and she stopped, pressed her lips together. I didn't know what I was living inside of. I thought I knew. I had no idea. The weight of that sentence sat between them. Dante said carefully, that's what people like Carlo depend on. The gap between what someone is told and what's actually happening. The gap stays open because they control the information. Elena looked at him. You understand that pretty specifically. I work in information, he said. I know what it looks like when someone manages it. And do you do that? Manage what people around you know. He held her gaze. Yes, she nodded slowly. It wasn't approval. It wasn't condemnation. It was just the acknowledgement of a person filing away an honest answer. Then we should probably keep that in mind, she said. Probably, he agreed. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. Outside the window, the city kept going, vast and indifferent, unaware of 2 people sitting across from each other in a corner table, in a coffee shop on West 22nd. Carefully, cautiously, beginning to figure out what the other one was made of. The recertification office was on the 14th floor of a building that smelled like carpet cleaner and ambition. I sat in a plastic chair outside the registrar's window, with a clipboard of forms in my lap and a pen that kept skipping, and I thought, this is how you do it. You just sit in the chair and fill out the forms. Not because you're ready. You're not ready. That was the lesson I was only starting to learn, that ready is a myth. Ready is what you tell yourself's coming, just a little further down the road, around the next corner, once things settle. Things don't settle. You do it scared. You do it with the skipping pen and the forms, and the particular fluorescent hum of a building that has no opinion about you one way or the other. Gia sat in the chair beside me. She'd offered to come. I'd said she didn't have to. She'd said, I know I don't have to. That's why I'm offering. Which was the right answer. So I'd let her. You don't have to be fully ready, she said. She was looking at the wall across from us, at a poster about continuing education requirements that neither of us was reading. I know. It's okay to start while you're still figuring it out. I know, Gia. I'm just being supportive. I know. I clicked the pen, tried the skipping part of the page again. I read something once, in a first-year textbook actually, that the most effective action usually happens not when fear goes away, but when you decide fear isn't the deciding factor. Gia turned to look at me. That's genuinely good. First year me had decent taste in source material. I got the pen working. I didn't understand it then. It was just a sentence I underlined. Now I filled in my name at the top of the form. Now I think I actually get it. Gia didn't say anything after that. She just sat there while I filled out the forms, occasionally handing me a new page when I finished one, which I hadn't asked her to do and didn't need to. That was enough. That was the whole thing, really. Someone in the chair beside you, handing you the next page. 3 days later, Dante knocked on my apartment door at 7 in the evening. I'd been home for an hour, still in my coat. Actually, I'd gotten back, taken my shoes off, and then gotten distracted, reading something on the counter, and never made it further into the apartment. That was my life lately. Half arrived everywhere. I opened the door. "Do you own a phone?" I asked. "I called," he said. "You didn't answer." I looked at my coat pocket. I'd turned the sound off at my appointment that morning and forgotten to turn it back on. Fair point. "I have an update on the documents." He held up a folder. "The first part of the trace is done." I stepped back from the door. He came in. He was dressed like he'd come from somewhere. Formal jacket, no tie, the kind of careful that means a meeting rather than an evening. He set the folder on the counter and stood with his hands loose at his sides, which I'd noticed he did when he was making a point of not taking up more space than he needed to. I was still in my coat. "Give me a second," I said. I hung it up. "Put the kettle on. Do you want coffee? If you're making it." "I'm making tea." "Then I'm fine." He opened the folder while I ran water, started walking me through it. The original transactions, the dates, the documentation of who'd actually signed off on what. It was methodical and thorough, and slightly hard to follow because the financial architecture of Carlo's world had never been something I'd been given a map of. I said so. He paused mid-explanation, looked at me. "Do you want me to simplify it? I want you to explain it differently." "I don't need simple. I need a different entry point." He considered that for a moment, then started over, from a different angle, using a different structure. Better. I tracked it more easily. I asked questions when I lost the thread, and he answered them without the particular impatience some men have when they're being asked to explain something they understand fluently to someone who doesn't. That was surprisingly rare, actually. The patience. We finished the folder. I made a note of 2 things I wanted to follow up with my attorney. Dante watched me write them down. "You kept your own legal counsel," he said, "through the marriage, carefully." He didn't know. He knew I had an attorney. He didn't know the extent of what she held for me. I capped the pen. I was systematic about it, kept certain things in her files, not in the house. It took a while to figure out what could leave the house without being noticed. Dante was quiet for a moment. "How long did that take you to work out?" "End of year 2. "What happened at the end of year 2? I looked at him. I figured out that there was no version of that marriage where I was going to be okay without an exit that was entirely mine. One he didn't have access to. I set the pen down. "So I built one, slowly, over 3 years, just in case." He held my gaze. Something in his expression was hard to name, not pity, not admiration exactly, more like recognition. The particular look of someone who understands survival as a practical problem and is respecting the solution. "That was smart," he said, simply. "Just that." "It kept me okay," I said. The kettle clicked off. I poured my tea. The kitchen was quiet, and the evening was doing its city thing outside the window, and something about the ordinariness of it was almost startling. 2 people in a kitchen, folder on the counter, tea in a mug. How normal it felt. How long it had been since normal felt like this, instead of like a performance of normal. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Yes." "Why psychology?" He raised an eyebrow slightly. "Not why did you study it? Why do you think it matters? What draws you to how people work?" I looked at my mug. "When I was little, I used to watch people and try to figure out what they were feeling versus what they were showing. I thought it was a game, like a puzzle." I wrapped my hands around the warmth. Later, I understood it was a survival skill I developed early. Some version of reading the room before the room could read me. He said nothing, and then I went to school for it and realized it wasn't just me, that this was a thing, that most people are doing some version of that performance all the time, and that understanding why was one of the more useful things a person could learn. I looked up. Carlo called it analyzing, like it was an accusation. I paused. "It was the most useful thing I had, and he tried to take it from me." "He didn't," Dante said. "No," I said. "He didn't." We looked at each other across the kitchen counter. Not a moment of anything cinematic. Just 2 people in a kitchen at 7 in the evening, holding the particular weight of a real conversation that had no agenda except the truth. He was afraid of it, Dante said. You knowing how to read people. He was afraid you'd read him. I know that now, I said. I think I knew it then too, somewhere. I just couldn't afford to know it. And now, I looked at him. Now I can afford most things. Vincent Rowe showed up at the office the following afternoon unannounced. Dante looked up from his desk. His brother was 32 years old and moved through the world with the particular energy of someone who had too much capability and not enough outlet for it. Smart, restless, one foot perpetually inside the family world, one foot perpetually looking for the door. You have a minute, Vincent said. Close the door. Vincent sat. He had Dante's stillness, without Dante's depth of it, still learning. Still, sometimes moving before he thought. He looked at his brother for a moment. Tell me about Elena Graves, he said. Her name is Elena Cross. Vincent tilted his head. You corrected me on the name. It's her name. Right. Vincent looked at him carefully. What's going on there, Dante? Business. That's not what Marcus said. Marcus talks too much. Marcus said you called her by her first name twice in one conversation. Vincent raised an eyebrow. You don't do that. Dante set his pen down. Looked at his brother. Vincent held up a hand. I'm not here to give you a hard time about it. I'm asking because I want to understand. What is it you want to understand specifically? Whether you know what you're doing. Vincent leaned forward. She's not a variable, Dante. She's been through something real. And men like you, he paused, chose his next words. Men who are used to deciding how things go. We don't always think about what that costs the other person. The room was quiet. It was a fair thing to say. Dante knew it was fair, which was the part that required some sitting with. I'm aware she's been through something, he said. Being aware of it and actually accounting for it are different things, Vincent said. I've seen you with people before. How you move toward what you want. And I'm asking you to think about whether how you move is the right move here. Whether what you want and what she needs are going the same direction. Dante looked at his brother. When did you get this thoughtful? He said. I've always been thoughtful. You just don't usually ask me things. That was also fair. Dante picked his pen back up. Not to write anything, just to have something in his hand. She's not someone I'm moving toward in the way you're thinking. Maybe not yet, Vincent. I'm just saying she's not a piece on the board. And I know you know that. I want you to keep knowing it. He stood. That's all. He left. Dante sat with the conversation for a long time. The honest answer, not the one he'd give anyone, but the one that existed below the operational layer where he actually lived, was that he thought about Elena Cross more than he thought about most things. That the particular quality of her attention, the directness of it, had gotten under his professional composure in a way that very few things managed. But Vincent wasn't wrong about the other part. Men who are used to deciding how things go. He thought about the surveillance journals Marcus had described. 5 years of documented control. 5 years of a man deciding how Elena's life would go, who she'd know, what she'd say, where she'd stand. He thought about the kind of man who built that. And then he thought, carefully and honestly, about whether there were any lines of similarity he needed to examine in himself. It was an uncomfortable thing to sit with. He sat with it anyway. I noticed the car on a Wednesday. I'd been out twice that day, once to the registrar's office to drop off paperwork, once to meet my attorney for lunch. By the second trip, something registered at the edge of my awareness, a dark blue sedan. Different neighborhood. Same car. I noted the plates without making it obvious I was noting them. By Thursday evening, I'd seen it 3 times. Different streets. Same car. The person inside making no particular effort to hide, which was either careless surveillance or a different kind of message entirely. I called Gia first. I think someone's watching me, I said. Dark blue sedan, I have the plates. For how long? 2 days confirmed. Possibly longer. What do you need? That was the question. Not what should you do, or let me call someone, or don't do anything until I get there. What did I need? I need to run the plates, I said. And I need to figure out if this is the Graves family or something else. I can run the plates, I know. Do that. I paused, and I'm going to call Ro. Gia was quiet for a moment. Not the surprised kind of quiet, the noting something kind. Okay, she said. I called him. He picked up on the second ring. I described the car, the plates, the 2-day pattern. He listened without interrupting. I can have someone check, he started. I know you can, I said. I'm not calling to hand this to you. I'm calling because you might have context I don't have. I paused. What do you know? Brief. Silence. Nothing yet, he said. But I want to find out. Then find out, I said, and tell me what you learn. Not what you decide to do about it, what you learn. That distinction matters to me. Another pause. Longer. Understood, he said. I hung up and stood at my window, looking down at the street. The sedan wasn't visible from this angle. That was fine. I wasn't trying to spot it. I was just standing there, in my own apartment, looking at my own city, thinking about the strange arithmetic of trusting someone. You couldn't do it all at once. You couldn't hand over everything and call it trust. That was just hope dressed up in a different coat. Real trust was incremental. It was the accumulation of small things, what someone did with informations you gave them. Whether they honored the limits you set, whether they were the same person when tested as they were when things were easy. I didn't trust Dante Rowe. Not yet, but I was watching, carefully, with the same eyes that had watched everything else. And, for the first time in a long time, watching felt less like survival and more like choice. That was something. That was actually something. The workshop was in a building on the east side that used to be a textile factory. High ceilings, big windows, the kind of space that had been it had stopped apologizing for what it used to be and just become what it was now. I liked that about it. There was something honest in a building that didn't pretend. 12 people in the room. Folding chairs arranged in a loose circle. The facilitator was a woman named Dr. Carol Wise, 60-something, gray hair, a cardigan with a coffee stain on the left cuff that she clearly hadn't noticed, and equally clearly would not have cared about if she had. The workshop was part of my recertification track, trauma-informed care. 6 hours across 2 sessions. I sat in the third chair from the door and put my notebook on my knee, and did the thing I do in rooms like this, looked around, took stock, assessed. Most of the people there were working professionals, therapists refreshing credentials, social workers. One man who introduced himself as a hospital chaplain and seemed to have been carrying something for so long he'd forgotten what his own shoulders felt like without it. I knew the academic material. I'd studied it. I could have placed each module within a larger framework and cited the primary research. But I'd never sat in a room like this as someone who'd lived it. That was different. That was a different thing entirely. Dr. Weiss started with something I didn't expect. She didn't open with theory or a framework or a list of definitions. She said, "Before we talk about anything else, I want to say this clearly. Surviving is an achievement, not a baseline. Not just what happens when worse things don't. An actual achievement that deserves to be named as one. And recovering, choosing, day after day, to move toward something instead of just away from something, that's a different achievement. Both are real. Both count." The room was quiet. I wrote it down, every word. Then I underlined the word choosing and sat there looking at it while she moved on to the first module. I'd read versions of that idea before. In textbooks, in research papers, in the margins of other people's notes. I'd probably written a paper that touched on it, but hearing it out loud, in a room, from a person who meant it, that was something the textbooks couldn't give you. That was the thing you had to be in the room for. I stayed for both sessions. I took 7 pages of notes. I ate a bad sandwich from the break table at lunch and had a conversation with the hospital chaplain about the particular loneliness of being the person in the room who is supposed to have answers. You stop expecting someone to ask how you're doing, he said. After a while, you stop noticing, you've stopped expecting it. And when someone does ask, I said, he looked at his coffee cup, it kind of breaks you open a little, in the good way, if you let it. I thought about that the whole train ride home. The Graves family charity gala was on a Friday. Nico had actually called, not texted, which was its own kind of message, to let me know the family expected me to attend, not to ask, to inform. The event was at a hotel on Park Avenue, the kind of venue that was chosen specifically because it made a statement about the kind of people who could afford to be there. I didn't want to go. I told Gia that on Thursday night. We were in her apartment, takeout containers between us, the television on mute. "Then don't," she said. "It's more complicated than that. It's always more complicated than that." She stabbed a piece of broccoli. "Tell me the complicated part. If I don't show up, they read it as weakness, or guilt, or movement away from the family that they'll use as justification for the next pressure tactic." I set my fork down. "They control the narrative if I'm absent. At least if I'm there, I'm in the room." Gia chewed, considered. So you're going. I'm going. What are you wearing? I bought something blue. She pointed her fork at me. Good. Good choice. Carlo had always chosen my clothes for events. Not overtly, not standing over me saying wear that. More like on it. When I wore something he didn't like. Delivered so reasonably, so lightly, that refusing it seemed disproportionate. Is that really the right choice for tonight? I just think the other dress is more. And so I wore the other dress. And then the other dress became the default. And then I stopped buying things he hadn't pre-approved. The blue dress was mine. That sounds small. It wasn't. The hotel ballroom was exactly what it was supposed to be: loud money, dressed up as philanthropy. Everyone performing a version of themselves they'd curated for maximum effect. I was good at rooms like this. I'd had 5 years of practice. I found the clients I actually needed to speak with, made the rounds, accepted a glass of sparkling water and held it like a prop, smiled at the right moments and went slightly vague at the others, which is the safest setting for a room where everyone is listening for information. Nico found me within 20 minutes. He was good at this too, the social approach that looked warm from the outside. He came in with a hand on my elbow, guiding me slightly toward a corner, the gesture so natural that anyone watching would have seen a caring brother-in-law checking in on his late brother's widow. I felt the grip though, slight but deliberate, the kind that isn't quite holding you still, but isn't quite letting you move freely either. I knew that grip. I'd felt it in different configurations for years. I kept my face exactly as it was, and then I felt something shift in the room. The particular way a space changes when someone significant enters it, a redistribution of attention, slight but definite. The way a room tips toward a new center of gravity without anyone admitting it. I didn't turn immediately. I finished my sentence to Nico about the foundation's endowment structure and then, naturally, looked toward the entrance. Dante Rowe was across the room, dark jacket, standing with a senator and a man I recognized as a private equity figure, speaking with the measured ease of someone who occupied every room like he'd been there before the room existed. He saw me at the same moment. Zero delay. The same instant I looked, he was already looking. I turned back to Nico. 15 minutes later, Nico was still talking. His hand had moved from my elbow to my arm, just above the wrist, still subtle. Still the kind of thing that would look like nothing if you photographed it, but it wasn't nothing. I set my glass on the tray of a passing server, deliberate. It required me to move my arm. I need to step away for a moment, I said pleasantly. Excuse me. I walked toward the bar without rushing. Passing Dante meant passing him. The room's geography made it natural. I didn't slow down. Neither did he. But I said quietly, "Thank you for not coming over." And he said just as quietly, "You didn't need me to." 2 sentences, both true. I found the rooftop terrace by accident. There was a door at the end of a hallway marked staff only that someone had propped open. And beyond it, a stairwell, and beyond that, a terrace that nobody at the event seemed to know about. Cold up here. The city below looked the way cities look from above at night, like something that doesn't know you're watching it, and is therefore entirely itself. I stood at the railing and breathed. The door opened behind me. I wasn't surprised. I'd heard the footstep in the stairwell, quiet but present and known. Dante came to stand at the railing a few feet to my left, not close, just there. Looking at the same city. "How did you find this?" I asked. "I find things." "That's not an answer." "Staff told me." I asked. I almost smiled. "You asked. You seemed like you needed air. This seemed like where you'd go." We stood there for a moment. The cold was the honest kind, no pretense in it, no performance. Just temperature. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Yes." "Do you ever want to leave it?" I looked out at the city. All of it. The whole structure of it. "Do you ever think about what it would be like to just not?" He was quiet for long enough that I looked over at him. He was looking at the city, not at me. "Every time I try to imagine it," he said, "I don't know what I am on the other side. This is the only world I know how to operate in, the only set of rules I fully understand." He paused. "That's not a complaint. It's just accurate. I knew someone who said something like that, Carlo. He used it to explain why nothing could ever change, why the way things were was the way things had to be." I looked back at the city. "But the way you just said it, it sounds different. Like a question you're actually asking yourself instead of a wall you're building." He turned his head and looked at me. "Are you afraid of me?" he asked. I thought about it honestly. Not the polite answer, not the strategic answer, the actual one. Not the way you mean, I said. What I'm afraid of is that you might be someone I could trust. And I've spent a long time in a situation where trust was exactly the thing that was used against me. I looked at him. So I'm cautious about it. Not because of what you are, because of what I learned. He held my gaze. I don't want you to trust me because I asked for it, he said, or because I convinced you. I want to earn it, however long that takes. That's the right answer. I know, he said. It's also what I actually mean. The city moved below us, indifferent and continuous. The cold settled in around us, and something else settled too, something quieter. The particular quality of a moment that is becoming something, neither of us pushing it, neither of us running from it. When we moved toward each other, it wasn't a decision I could point to. It was more like the way two things that have been adjacent for long enough finally close the remaining distance. Not urgent, not performed. He was very still. I put my hand against his chest, not to pull him in, not to hold him off, just to feel, to make sure this was real and not another performance. Not another thing I was participating in, without fully knowing what I was agreeing to. His heart was beating faster than I expected. So was mine. When we separated, neither of us spoke for a moment. The city kept going. Somewhere below us, the gala kept going. Everything kept going. This is complicated, I said. Yes. I'm not ready for the kind of complicated that looks like what I had. I looked at him directly. I need you to understand that clearly. Not as a warning, as a fact about where I am. I understand it. Do you? You were with a man who called your instincts analyzing and your judgment overreacting. He held my eyes. I'm not going to do that. I'm not interested in a version of this where you're smaller. I looked at him for a long moment. Let me think, I said. Take whatever time you need. He meant it. That was the thing I was looking for, the tension behind it. The slight impatience, the way meaning something and waiting for it to be convenient are often different things. I didn't find it. I went back inside first. He stayed on the terrace, and I carried that kiss and that conversation and the sound of his heart beating faster than expected all the way home, where I sat on my own couch in my own apartment and thought about what it meant to be cautious and brave at the same time. Because I was learning, those weren't opposites. They were often the same thing. Detective Anna Torres came to my apartment on a Tuesday morning. He called first. That mattered. She identified herself clearly, said she had questions about Carlo's final weeks, said she could come to me, or I could come to her, my preference. She said it in the tone of someone who was giving me an actual choice, rather than performing the gesture of one. I said to come to me, my space, my terms. She was younger than I expected, early 40s maybe, dark hair pulled back, a coat that had seen some mileage. She had the kind of face that didn't give you much, not unfriendly, but professionally neutral. Like she'd learned to hold her reactions back, far enough that they didn't affect the room. I understood that. I'd learned the same skill under different circumstances. I made coffee. She accepted it. We sat at the kitchen table. I'll be direct with you, she said. Carlo Graves's death is still under review. The official findings don't fully satisfy my department. I'm not here to accuse you of anything. I'm here because you were closest to him in his final months. And I think you may have information that's useful even if you don't know it's useful. What are you looking for? Behavior changes. Conversations that seemed unusual. Anyone he was afraid of or angry at in ways that stood out. She paused. Anything that felt different. I thought about this honestly. He was tense. The last 2 or 3 months. He had calls he took outside. He was less predictable. His schedule got more irregular. I looked at my coffee. I assumed it was business. He didn't discuss business with me. Torres nodded, making notes. Did you know about the financial withdrawals from his accounts in March? I found out after. Through his estate documents. Any idea where the money went? I've been trying to find out, I said. I have people working on it. She didn't ask who, just nodded again. Then she looked at me in a different way. Not the note-taking way. Queter, Mrs. Graves, she said, then paused. Or do you prefer Graves? Or Cross, I said. Elena Cross. Something shifted in her expression, barely visible. But there, Miss Cross, she said. I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to know you don't have to answer it. And however you answer it, it doesn't change anything about this investigation. I waited. Were you safe? She said. In your marriage, were you physically safe? The kitchen was very quiet. I'd been asked variations of that question before. Is everything okay at home? You seem tired. You've been quieter lately. The questions people ask when they know something is wrong, but need you to say it first. Torres wasn't asking because she needed me to say it first. She was asking because she'd looked at a file and seen something in it. And she was asking directly, without pretense, without building up to it with three other questions. That kind of directness had been rare in my life. I hadn't always known what to do with it. Not consistently, I said. She nodded slowly, reached into the folder beside her, and placed a card on the table. Set it down gently, not pushed across, just placed. This is the victim support unit, she said. They work independently from the criminal investigation. Whatever happens with our case, with Carlos' death, this exists separately. You have the right to use it. There's no obligation attached to it. I looked at the card. I didn't pick it up immediately. I just looked at it. The investigation, I said. Is it, do you have a direction? I can't discuss specifics, Torres said. But I'll tell you this. We're thorough, and we take our time. She closed her folder. If you think of anything, you can reach me directly. She pushed her own card across, different from the support unit card. Just her name, her number, day or night. She stood. I walked her to the door. At the threshold, she turned back. You asked for this conversation to happen here, she said. In your space. Yes. That's smart. She said it without elaboration. Just a fact, acknowledged. I closed the door after her. Then I picked up the support unit card from the table and held it. It was just cardstock, just an address and a phone number. But there was something in having it, in someone putting it there without requiring anything in return. That was unexpectedly heavy. The weight of being seen, without being asked to perform anything in exchange. I put it in my wallet, in the slot behind my library card, and then I called Gia, because some things need to be said out loud before they become real. Dante called the same afternoon. I found the car, he said. Something in his voice was different, careful in a way that was deliberate rather than natural. Who was it? I said. A pause. One of my staff, lower level. He wasn't acting on any order from me. He was following an old habit, tracking people, connected to the organization's name. He thought he was being protective. I sat down. He's been following me since when? 10 days, possibly 12. I didn't say anything. Dante continued. I want to explain what I did, not just what happened. I called him in. I didn't threaten him. I told him exactly why it was wrong, not wrong, because he lacked authorization. Wrong, because you are a person who just spent years having every movement monitored without her consent, and what he did wasn't protection. It was doing the same thing to you that someone else had already done. I was still quiet. He doesn't work for me anymore, Dante said. Not as punishment. Because if he can't understand why that was wrong, he can't work for me. The words landed one at a time. And you're telling me this, I said, instead of handling it quietly. Because you told me that the distinction between knowing and not knowing matters to you. And because I handled the tale on Nico, by making a decision on your behalf without telling you first. I told you that was wrong. I meant it. A pause. This is me not repeating it. I looked at the wall across from me. In your world, I said slowly, that's how it's always been done. Knowing where people are. Monitoring the people around you. That's been called protection. Yes. And you never questioned it, not seriously. Not until recently. What changed recently? He didn't answer immediately. I read accounts, he said carefully, from people who worked in Carlo's house, about what the atmosphere was like, about what daily life looked like for you. He paused, and I recognized some of the architecture, the logic of it, control framed as care, monitoring framed as protection. I recognized the structure, because I've operated inside a version of the same one. He stopped. The degree is different. I understand the degree is different, but I'm not comfortable with the similarity. The room was very quiet. That was a hard thing to say. I understood that. Men who have been powerful for a long time don't easily say I recognize something troubling in myself. They don't do it unless they mean it. I thought about the 5 years inside Star Carlos' structure, the way it had its own coherence, its own logic, the way every individual piece had an explanation. and how the explanation wasn't the point. The point was the pattern. The point was what the pattern did to the person living inside it. Thank you for telling me, I said. Both things. The car and the rest of it. I should have told you about Nico the same day. Yes, you should have. I let that stand for a moment. But you're telling me now. That counts. Does it count enough? I thought about it honestly. It's a start, I said, which is more than some people manage. I found the paper on a Wednesday night. I'd been going through boxes I'd moved from the villa, things I hadn't unpacked yet, stacked against the wall of the second bedroom I was using as an office. Most of it was professional material. Old notebooks, reference guides, a folder of printed research I'd accumulated in graduate school. Near the bottom of the third box, a manila folder. Third-year coercive control, patterns and interventions. A seminar paper. 32 pages, annotated, graded. I'd gotten an A-. The minus was for a section my professor said was too clinical, not enough acknowledgement of survivor complexity. I sat down on the floor right there, between the boxes. I started reading it. It was a good paper. Technically accurate, thorough citations. I'd been careful and methodical, and had clearly understood the material at an academic level. And it described, in language I'd written myself at 22 years old, exactly what would happen to me. Not the specific events, not Carlo's name, but the pattern, the gradual erosion, the monitoring framed as affection, the way a person could be made to police themselves so thoroughly that external control became almost secondary. I'd written about it. I'd analyzed it. I'd cited researchers who'd studied it for decades. I read the whole paper. When I finished, I sat with it in my lap for a long time. The crying started quietly. Not the dramatic kind, not heaving sobs. Not a release I could frame as cathartic. Just a slow, tired, ongoing kind of grief. Not for Carlo. Not even entirely for the years I'd lost. For the 22-year-old who wrote this paper. Who had understood, academically and precisely, the mechanisms of this kind of harm, who had been smart and careful and capable, who would go on to live inside the things she'd studied without recognizing it, not because she wasn't paying attention, because it didn't look the same from the inside, because knowledge and experience are different things, and the distance between them is where people get hurt. I cried for her, for the version of me that deserved better information, not about coercive control, but about herself, about her own worth. About the fact that being smart didn't make you immune, and that not recognizing something while you were inside it didn't mean you'd failed. I called Gia at 12:40 in the morning. She answered on the second ring. No, what's wrong? No, are you okay? Just, I'm coming. You don't have to. I'll be there in 20 minutes. She was there in 18. She sat on the floor with me without asking for an explanation. I showed her the paper. She read enough of it to understand. Then she set it aside and sat, with her back against the wall, and her legs out in front of her. And she didn't say anything therapeutic. She didn't tell me to look on the bright side, or that this proved I'd known something all along. She just stayed. Around 2 in the morning, she went to the kitchen and made tea. Bad tea. The kind that sits too long and goes slightly bitter. She brought it back and handed me a mug, and sat back down. I wrote that paper, I said finally. I know. I understood all of it, theoretically, and I still didn't, I know. She wrapped both hands around her own mug. Yes, that paper, the knowledge in it, it wasn't a failure. It didn't fail you. She looked at me sideways. Knowing how something works doesn't mean you can see it clearly when you're standing inside it. That's not a flaw in you. That's how it works. That's what the research says. Your own research says that. I looked at the paper sitting on the floor beside me. I know, I said. Do you believe it? I thought about the first time Gia had asked me that question. The night she told me it wasn't my fault. How I'd said I knew it, and she'd asked if I believed it, and I'd said this is the first time I actually do. That had been the beginning of something. I understood that now. Not a conclusion. A starting point. I'm getting there, I said. She nodded. We sat on the floor of my second bedroom until almost 4, the bad tea going cold between us. The boxes still unpacked around us, the city doing its night version of itself outside the window. There's a specific kind of comfort in being seen at your worst, and having the person beside you stay anyway. Not because you're performing something worthy of their presence. Not because you've held it together. Just because you're there, and they're there. And that's enough. I thought about Dr. Weiss's words from the workshop. Surviving is an achievement. I thought about the 22-year-old who wrote that paper and the 30-year-old sitting on the floor with cold tea and wet eyes and a best friend who showed up in 18 minutes. Both of those people were me. The distance between them was everything I'd survived. That wasn't nothing. That was actually, honestly, not nothing. Nico came to Dante's office on a Thursday. He didn't have an appointment. He didn't need one. Showing up without warning was its own kind of statement, and Nico had always been fluent in that language. Marcus called Dante's cell from the front desk. Nico Graves is here. That was all. He didn't editorialize. He didn't need to. Dante told him to send him up. Nico walked in like he owned the room. Not aggressively, just with the particular ease of a man who'd never had to ask permission for anything. He sat across from Dante's desk without being invited to and set a manila envelope on the surface between them. Dante looked at it. Open it, Nico said. Inside, photographs. Elena and Dante at the coffee shop on West 22nd. Elena and Dante at the gala. Two figures on a rooftop terrace, clothes, the city below them. Dante looked at each one. Then he set them down and looked at Nico. She is the widow of my brother, Nico said. Whatever your history with him, she belongs to our family. Her name is Elena Cross, Dante said. Nico blinked. Elena Graves, Elena Cross. Dante said it again, slower. That's what she goes by. That's who she is. I'd get comfortable with that. You're making a mistake. I make my own mistakes. Dante leaned back. That's the thing about them. Nico's expression tightened. There are agreements between organizations, about boundaries. About those agreements cover territory and operations. Dante kept his voice entirely even. There is no clause in any agreement, written or otherwise, about who a woman is allowed to speak with, or see, or trust. He looked at Nico directly. Elena Cross is not a piece of territory. You say that like it changes anything. It changes everything, Dante said. The fact that you don't see that is something you should think about. Nico picked up his envelope, stood. The calculation was visible on his face, how hard to push, how much this was actually going to cost. He decided not to push. Not today. This isn't over, he said. Most things aren't, Dante agreed. Dante did not call me that afternoon. I found out through Marcus, who called my cell at 6, with the factual delivery of a man relaying information he'd been asked to relay. Nico Graves was here this morning, he said, with photographs. Mr. Rowe handled it. I thought you should know. Did Mr. Rowe ask you to call me? A pause. No. Thank you, Marcus. I hung up and called Dante. He answered on the second ring. You weren't going to tell me, I said. A pause, not the calculating kind, the honest kind, where someone is deciding whether to be defensive or just accurate. I was going to wait until I had a clearer picture of what Nico intended to do next, he said. That's not your call, I know. Dante, I said his name carefully. We talked about this. The difference between protecting me and deciding what I'm allowed to know about my own situation. You said you understood it. I did understand it. And then, you did the other thing anyway. He was quiet. Yes, he said. I waited. I'm sorry, he said. Not as a way to end the conversation. Actually, sorry. You had the right to know today. Not whenever I'd finished assessing it. I stood at my kitchen window. The city below was doing its evening thing, indifferent and ongoing. Thank you, I said, for saying it directly. Does this, he stopped. Does it what? Does it change things between us? I thought about that honestly. It tells me something, I said, that you did it. And it tells me something else, that you're not making excuses for it right now. I leaned against the counter. People don't change a lifetime of habits in 6 weeks. I know that. What I'm watching for is whether you know it too. He was quiet for a moment. I know it, he said. I'm working on it. That's all I'm asking. The anonymous call came 3 nights later. I was at the studio working late, papers spread across the desk, cold coffee, the particular silence of a building after hours that makes every small sound land differently. My phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. Miss Cross, male voice. Careful. I have information about Nico Graves. I believe you have reason to want it. A pause. He knows about the documents your attorney holds. He believes you received them from Rowe. He's decided that removing you from the situation is simpler than managing you. My blood went cold. Very specifically cold, not all at once, but starting at my hands and moving inward. Removing, I said. I want to be precise. I don't have specific details. What I know is that the conversation happened 48 hours ago, and the word used was elimination. The call ended. I sat with the phone in my hand for 30 seconds. I counted them. 30 seconds of complete stillness while my mind ran through everything at once. Then I called Dante. He answered on the first ring. Someone just called me, I said. My voice was steady. I was aware of choosing to make it steady. Anonymous. They said, Nico is planning to eliminate the problem. Me. I stopped. I need you to know that. What you do with it is partially up to me. Where are you? The studio. Stay there. Lock the door. I'll call you back in 5 minutes. Dante, 5 minutes, please. I locked the door. I stood in the center of the room with my hands very still and my heart doing something loud and fast inside my chest. There is a specific kind of fear that is entirely rational, not panic, not spiral, just the clear recognition that something is old and serious and requires real serious thinking. I stayed with it. I didn't perform calm. I just stayed with it until the phone rang again. My driver is 4 minutes away, Dante said. He'll park outside. Don't leave, you can see him through the window. You're asking me to trust your judgment right now. I'm asking you to be alive tomorrow. His voice had shifted, still controlled, but underneath it something uncontrolled, something that had dropped the careful layer. Elena, please. I looked at the locked door. All right, I said. He was in the lobby when the car pulled up. He looked at me. The way you look at something you were afraid you'd lost and haven't. A specific, comprehensive look. Then he put his hands on my arms, not pulling me in, just present, just there. Are you hurt? I'm fine. I'm taking care of this tonight, he said. Taking care of it how? He held my eyes. Nico threatened your life. He made that calculation and he was wrong, and he needs us to understand clearly that it cannot happen again. He paused. I'm going to have a conversation with Don Carmine. Your attorney's documents include evidence of fund transfers Nico made that implicate people Don Carmine cannot afford to be implicated with. Don Carmine will make the situation clear to Nico. I processed that. You're using leverage, I said. Yes, I told you not to. You told me not to use it over your career and your professional independence. His voice was steady. This is your life, Elena. That's a different line. I told you it was. I looked at him, standing in that lobby at 11 at night, having come here because I called him. All right, I said quietly. He held my gaze a moment longer. 1 hour, he said. Sergio stays with you. He left. I went upstairs and stood at the window and thought about the world I'd married into, and the world I'd grown up in, and the world I was choosing now, and whether the distances between them were as large as I needed them to be. The answer was complicated. Most true things are. He came back in 70 minutes. He looked tired in the specific way that isn't physical. The tiredness of someone who has done something that needed to be done and is still feeling the weight of it settling. Nico steps back from leadership, he said. Don Carmine made that clear. The threat is resolved. Permanently as these things are. He looked at me. You're safe. I crossed the room, put my hand against his chest, felt his heartbeat even, steady. The heartbeat of a man who had just held something very heavy and set it down, and was still carrying the memory of the weight. Thank you, I said. Don't thank me. This was the minimum. I looked up at him, and I saw on his face, beneath the steadiness, something I hadn't seen there before. Something that wasn't controlled. Something that looked like a man who'd spent 30 years being careful, and was only now, slowly, letting that carefulness mean something instead of just function as protection. He kissed me, different from the rooftop. Not a question this time, an answer. 3 days later, he knocked on my door at 9 in the evening. I opened it and read his face immediately. Something was wrong. Not danger, wrong, heavier than that. The particular weight of a truth someone has been carrying that is about to become someone else's to carry too. I opened the door wider. He sat at the kitchen table. I sat across from him. He told me about Vincent, all of it. How Vincent had pieced together what Carlo was building, the trap for Dante, the documents, the plan to use me as collateral. How Vincent had acted alone. How he'd made the decision the way he'd been raised, to make decisions in a world where problems got eliminated. How Carlo's death wasn't natural. I listened without interrupting. When he stopped, the kitchen was very quiet. What did you decide? I asked. I'm cooperating with the investigation, giving Torres everything she needs. He met my eyes, including Vincent. I looked at him. That will cost you significantly. Yes. Your own brother. Yes. His voice didn't waver. The right thing doesn't stop being the right thing because it's expensive. He paused. And I can't sit across from you knowing everything I know about what you survived and make peace with covering up the truth because it's convenient for me. Those two things can't exist in the same space. I held his gaze for a long moment. You could have not told me, I said. Handled it some other way. I wouldn't have known. You would have, eventually. And even if you hadn't, he stopped, looked at his hands. I would have known. And I'm done making choices I have to hide. Something settled in the room. Not resolution, it wasn't that clean. Just the particular weight of a true thing being said, out loud, by someone who understood what it cost. I went to see Donna Rose on a Thursday afternoon. I hadn't been back to the villa since I moved out. The drive felt strange, familiar roads. Different version of me making the trip. She met me in the front room. Same sofa. Same posture. But something in her face had shifted since the funeral. The organized grief had cracked at the edges. She looked older. Not worse, just more honest. I told her. Not everything at once. I told it the way it actually was, piece by piece. The real shape of what those 5 years had been. The monitoring. The systematic isolation. What I'd found in the safe. What I'd understood too late. She listened. I watched her face move through denial, quick, reflexive. The first instinct. Then something more complicated. Then stillness. She looked at the window for a long time. I saw things, she said finally. Her voice was different. The composure shows her was still there, but something underneath it had given way. Small things. The way he'd sometimes redirect you in conversation. The way you got quieter over the years. She stopped. Told myself it was how marriages work, that I was projecting, that it wasn't my business. Donna rose. I looked away. She turned back to me and her eyes were wet. I loved him and I looked away and I am so sorry, Elena. That doesn't fix anything. But I mean it. I looked at this woman who had been my mother-in-law and my warden and my grief companion and my adversary, sitting across from me in the room I'd performed in for 5 years. I know you loved him, I said. I'm not asking you to stop. Love and truth can exist in the same place. They have to sometimes. I paused. Acknowledging what he did doesn't cancel the love, it just makes it honest. She pressed her lips together, nodded once. We didn't embrace. That wasn't our language, but we sat together for a while. 2 women in a room that had held a lot of performances, finally not performing anything. Torres came to the apartment the following week. She laid out what they had, what Vincent had admitted to, what the investigation had confirmed. She was precise and clear, and she told me everything I was legally entitled to know. Which was more than I'd expect. At the end, she said, "You did the right thing, bringing what you had to us." I wanted the truth, I said, not the version that was convenient. She nodded. That's rarer than it should be, she said. After she left, I stood in the middle of my apartment and took stock of where I was, of where I'd been, of the distance between those two things. The distance was measurable now. I could see both ends of it. That was new. That was something that hadn't been possible a year ago. 6 weeks later, Dante found me at the coffee shop on West 22nd. I was at the corner table, with a recertification textbook and the specific focus of a person who is genuinely interested in what she's reading. He came in and set a coffee on the table beside my elbow before he sat down. I looked up. "You knew my order," I said. "The owner told me. You asked." He sat. I asked. I looked at the coffee. Then at him. There were things I wanted to say that I'd been organized carefully for days, because careful organization was how I did things. But sitting across from him in the morning light, with the coffee he'd asked about, the careful organization fell away a little. "I want to be direct with you about something," I said. "All right, I'm choosing this. Whatever this is." I held his gaze. Not because I don't have other options. Not because I'm afraid of what happens if I don't. Because I'm choosing it. I paused. That distinction is important to me. Maybe the most important thing. He was quiet for a moment. "I understand why," he said. "Do you? Because for years your choices weren't yours." He said it simply. "And the only version of this that works is one where they are." I nodded. "There are things I'll need," I said. "Not as conditions, just as facts about who I am. Tell me. My independence isn't negotiable. My work, my decisions, my ability to move through the world on my own terms." I looked at him. "Not because I don't trust you. Because I need to trust myself first. I spent years not trusting myself. I'm still rebuilding that. I know. You'll want to fix things sometimes. Step in. Manage it. Yes, he said honestly. And I'll need you to stop yourself. Or if you can't stop yourself, to tell me what you're doing and why. And let me respond. I paused. I can work with someone who struggles with this. I can't work with someone who pretends they don't. He looked at me across the table. I'll struggle with it, he said. I won't pretend I don't. And I'll tell you when it happens. That's all I was asking. The coffee shop moved around us. The morning continued its ordinary business. Two people at a corner table, not performing anything, not managing the impression they were making, just being straightforwardly honest with each other. It was quieter than I expected. The best things usually are. I passed my recertification exam on a Tuesday morning. Called Gia from the lobby of the testing center while people streamed past me. Tell me, she said. I passed. She made a sound that was somewhere between a cheer and a cry, and committed fully to neither. I knew it, she said. Obviously, I knew it. But also, Elle, you did it. I stood in that lobby with people moving around me, and I let myself feel it. Not the performance of feeling it, actually feel it. The specific weight of having done something hard, alone, that belonged entirely to me. Yeah, I said. I did. 3 months later, I saw my first client, a young woman, 23. She sat in the chair across from mine and looked at the room like she was still deciding whether to stay in it. I don't know if I actually have a problem, she said. Everyone keeps telling me I'm overreacting. I looked at her. I knew that sentence. I'd said versions of it myself. In my head, in conversations with Gia, in the quiet of rooms where I thought nobody was listening. You're not overreacting, I said. And you don't need anyone's confirmation for your experience to be real. It's real because you're living it. She pressed her lips together. Then she started to cry. Not because I'd said anything extraordinary. Just because someone had said plainly, without conditions, without requiring her to prove anything first, you're not imagining it. I didn't rush her. I let her cry. That was the work. Sitting across from someone while they put down something they've been carrying, not solving it, not speeding it up, just being present while they do the hard thing at their own pace. I understood that now from both sides of the room. That evening Dante came over. He had become, gradually and without announcement, someone who knocked on my door on Tuesday evenings. Not every Tuesday, just enough of them that I'd started to expect it, and then to look forward to it, and then to recognize the looking forward as something real, rather than something to be cautious about. We sat on the balcony. The city below was doing its November thing, gray and lit and entirely itself. How was today? He asked. Hard, I said. And right, he nodded. We sat with that for a moment. I want to tell you something, I said. He turned to look at me. A year ago, I stood at Carlo's grave, and I knew exactly what my life was going to be. I'd mapped the quiet, the management, the slow disappearing. I looked at the city. I had accepted it. I thought acceptance was wisdom. And now I think acceptance was exhaustion. I looked at him. There's a difference. Wisdom knows why it's staying. Exhaustion just stops fighting. I paused. I know why I'm here now. That's new. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I've been in love with you, he said, since I watched you order white roses for a man who wanted red, and understood, in that one moment, everything it had cost you to still be standing. He looked at me. Every conversation since has been confirmation. I looked at him in the November light. That's a very specific thing to say. I'm a specific person. Yes, I said. You are. I put my hand in his. Not a gesture of romance, an act of choice. Conscious, deliberate, made by a person who knew exactly what she was doing and why. The city stretched out in every direction. Ancient and ongoing and completely indifferent to the two of us on a balcony in November, choosing something carefully and honestly and with full knowledge of what it cost and what it gave. I thought about everything it had taken to get to a place where a choice felt like a choice. I thought about Gia on the floor at 4 in the morning, about Dr. Weiss and her coffee-stained cardigan, about the 22-year-old who wrote that paper, about Torres setting a card on my kitchen table without requiring anything in return, about all the people who had made it possible to be sitting here, holding my own hand out to something, freely. I used to think freedom meant being alone, I thought. No one close enough to hurt me. Now I think freedom means I'm here because I chose to be, not because I was told to stay, not because I was afraid to leave. I could leave. I'm choosing not to. That's the whole thing. That's everything. The characters, settings, and events portrayed in this story are entirely fictional. While certain themes may echo real-life experiences, They are shaped by creative interpretation. The author does not intend to represent or depict any specific individual, organization, or historical event.
In the end, this story is not only about a mafia world, a dangerous man, or a widow trying to escape the shadow of her husband. It is a story about survival, truth, and the long, painful journey back to yourself after someone has spent years teaching you to doubt your own voice. Elena Cross begins this story standing at her husband's grave, unable to cry, not because she is heartless, but because a part of her had already been grieving for years. She had been grieving the woman she used to be, the life she thought she would have, and the freedom that was slowly taken from her one small compromise at a time. The deepest lesson this story gives us is that abuse does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes dressed as love, protection, concern, or tradition. It can hide in small comments, quiet corrections, controlled choices, and the slow isolation of a person from everyone who once made them feel real. Elena's journey reminds us that being smart, strong, educated, or self-aware does not make someone immune to being hurt. Trauma is not a failure of intelligence. Survival is not weakness. And healing does not begin the moment the danger ends. Sometimes healing begins much later, when a person finally feels safe enough to name what happened. Dante Rowe's role in this story is also meaningful because he is not presented as a perfect savior. He is powerful, dangerous, and shaped by a world where control is often mistaken for protection. But what makes him different is his willingness to listen, to be corrected, and to change. He learns that loving Elena does not mean managing her life, making decisions for her, or protecting her without her consent. True love does not make someone smaller. True love creates space for a person to stand fully as themselves. And that is the heart of this story. Freedom is not simply being away from the person who hurt you. Freedom is having choices again. Freedom is saying yes because you want to, not because you are afraid to say no. Freedom is rebuilding trust in your own judgment after years of being told your instincts were wrong. Elena does not find peace because someone else chooses it for her. She finds it because she chooses herself again and again, even when she is scared, even when her hands shake, even when the road forward is uncertain. For the audience, this story reminds us that healing is not always dramatic. Sometimes it looks like filling out forms, calling a friend, sitting in silence, going back to work, telling the truth, or choosing a blue dress because it belongs to you. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is not revenge, not escape, not even forgiveness, but simply reclaiming the right to decide what happens next. Elena's final choice is powerful because it is truly hers. She can leave. She can stay. She can love. She can walk away. And because she has that freedom, her choice finally means something. That is the message this story leaves behind. Love without freedom is just another cage, but love with truth, respect, and choice can become a place where a wounded person learns not only to survive, but to live again.